Hey guys, I'm Bobby Childs from Adventures in Whiskey. I'm glad to be hosting Stephen Wilson. He's the National Brand Ambassador for Crown Royal. Stephen, say hi.
Hey, Bobby, thanks for having me, man. It's a pleasure to share some great whiskey with you tonight. Of course, it's always a pleasure to share Crown Royal, and hello to everybody out there watching tonight.
I'm so excited because I I was a bourbon guy a few years back. Then I got into Scotch. I'm sure you've heard this a bunch of times. And I decided when I decided to try different world whiskeys, I thought the neighbor up north would be kind of the one to try first. Um, I tried the standard Crown Royal,
Right.
but the three others will be my first time trying it with you. And I was found Crown to be just a very smooth, very sweet, little spicy, especially like the Northern Harvest Rye that you guys put out a couple years back.
I always say there's a reason that whiskey won World Whiskey of the Year in 2016 because it really does. I mean, to me, it embodies what a great Canadian rye should be. Absolutely gorgeous flavor. You know, the baking spices, kind of that little hint of nutmeg coming in, that little bit of sweetness, just really well balanced. That creaminess of Crown Royal. So, you know, if you pick a whiskey from the Crown Royal family, Bobby, you're never going to go wrong. Trust me.
So how did you get in the business? Like, give me a little bit about your background.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You saw me nodding when you were talking about starting with bourbons and kind of moving your way into Scotch whiskey. And, you know, I've been working in the whiskey industry for a little over 10 and a half years, you know, and first and foremost, I've always just been a guy who's loved whiskey. I've always found whiskey to be very intriguing and just something almost magical about it. I grew up on the Tennessee-Virginia border.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, my first experience with whiskey was very similar to yours, where it was, you know, bourbons and American whiskeys and Tennessee whiskeys. And once I moved to New York and all of a sudden this other world of whiskey kind of started to open up and I discovered Scotch whiskey. I still remember the first Scotch whiskey I ever tasted. Irish whiskey. What's that?
Which is?
Lagavulin, actually. And I know you and I were talking about some peatier whiskeys last week, but yeah.
That's a fantastic whiskey.
I've always kind of chuckled inside because I don't know if you told me you've never had Scotch, I don't know that's what I would pour you to start your journey into Scotch whiskey. But the gentleman who thought that was a great idea, I thank him to this day because it certainly made me go, wow, okay, I want to learn more. I want to know more. And then, of course, you know, Irish whiskey. And so I've been very lucky over the years because I've worked across all of those different styles of whiskey. I've worked with single malts. I've worked with blended scotches. I've worked with Irish whiskeys and bourbons and American whiskeys and Tennessee whiskeys. Crown Royal is one of those whiskeys that I still remember the first time I experienced Crown Royal. And I still remember how all of a sudden it was that same aha moment of, wow, this is really unique. This is different. This is different than all these other types of whiskey out there. So when I had the opportunity about a year and a half ago at this point, almost 2 years, to really kind of focus my energy and my time with the Crown team, both in Gimli and Manitoba and at LaSalle, just outside of Montreal. And then, of course, our team here in the States and in North America. I just leapt at the opportunity because it's a whiskey that's always been very near and dear to my heart. But the chance to dive in and really get to play and get to experiment and get to learn more like you like to do day in and day out. It's just fantastic.
What I like about most of these is compared to a lot of the bourbons that I usually drink, these are just a bit more mellow, a bit more refined. It really takes a while. It takes a little patience and it's much rewarded to taste the subtleties, smell the subtleties, compared to, you know, big cask strength bourbons that you find around here.
Well, you know, I was just recently, I attended the Canadian Whiskey Awards in Victoria, British Columbia. And it was just a lovely evening to see the Canadian whiskey industry come together and to really celebrate the successes of Canadian whiskey and kind of what's starting to happen with Canadian whiskey, which is more and more folks, just like ourselves and the folks watching, we're starting to take that second look at Canadian whiskey. And we're starting to say, wow, there's some really incredible whiskey that they're making, especially for us up north. But one of the speakers that evening made a great point, and he said, you know, he remembered the first time he basically sat down and really kind of did a full Canadian whiskey tasting. And he said it was interesting because he found Canadian whiskey to be super approachable and palatable and soft and creamy and like little light hints of spice. And in my mind, I'm thinking that's Crown Royal, that's Crown Royal, that's Crown Royal. But that's what it is. That's Canadian whiskey. So yeah, we have those big bourbons or those big peaty Scotch whiskeys, but then we have this beautiful, gorgeous, soft, velvety, creamy Canadian whiskey. And for all of us, it's that one more style of whiskey.
Right.
Crown Royal to me just really embodies those characteristics. So.
I'll tell you what, let's, why don't we pour a little bit of the Crown Royal Deluxe.
Yeah, let's do it.
If you wouldn't mind giving me a little bit of the Crown Royal story.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say too, we'll taste it, and then we can also kind of talk about how that blend comes together.
Perfect.
Because what this is going to do, it's going to set us up for the rest of our evening as far as what you and I are going to talk about. Because Crown Royal, the Deluxe, is what started it all. To give you a little bit of history, I think one of the things I love about whiskey is the stories. Is when we look at distilleries that are hundreds of years old, or that grew out of the farms of Kentucky or wherever they were started. There's always these magical stories.
Mm-hmm.
Crown Royal is one of those stories because this is a whiskey that was created in 1939 for King George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth. So the King and Queen, they made their way over to Canada. Pretty big deal. And my mother-in-law is Canadian, so she's probably watching, and she'll be glad that I'm talking about Canadian history here. But we always talk about the fact that it was a big deal because it was the first time a reigning king and queen had visited Canada since Canada had become an independent nation.
Sure.
So it's a pretty big deal. So a young entrepreneur at the time, started kind of wrapping his head around, well, I want to create something special. I want to create something unique. I want to give a gift to the king and queen. He happened to be a very skilled whiskey maker, a very skilled blender, worked tirelessly day and night until he came up with a blend of what he felt was 50 of his finest whiskeys.
Sure.
And Crown Royal was born. So I always tell folks, that's the story. It's almost like mic drop. This was created for a king. We're done. It's a perfect whiskey. But when you look at the bottle, when you look at the purple bag, I mean, those are all royal elements. And this is a whiskey that was created as a gift. It was created to give to the king and queen. The story is that 10 cases were put on the royal train car. I don't think either of us were there, so I don't know with 100% certainty that king and queen enjoyed some, but I would like to think that they did.
I would assume. I mean, how can you not?
I mean, really, once you have a little taste, you're like, this is pretty good. I think they might have even circled that train back to Ontario on the way home.
Yeah.
We can just keep adding to the story, but it was out of that. It was out of that passion and that love that something really lovely and magical was created. And it's fun for me because when I work with our distillers and the hardworking men at our distillery, and I work with our blenders, they still embody that passion and that drive, because for them, this was a whiskey that was created over 75 years ago, and it was created for the king and queen, and they want to kind of keep that tradition alive. So let's have a little taste.
Sure.
And then we'll talk about how the blend comes together and really kind of dive into the nuts and bolts. And then from there, we'll taste through the other three lovely little friends you have next to the Deluxe.
Beautiful. That's the best idea you had all night.
Sometimes I'm good for one or two ideas. Just after 8 o'clock, I'm usually on point.
So my dad doesn't drink a lot of whiskey, but you ask him his favorite. Crown Royal.
My
standard. He loves Crown Royal, and he's probably watching now, so he'll appreciate that.
Well, Dad, thank you for your support. We'll have to get his insight on what he loves so much about Crown Royal. So yeah, just go ahead, and you got the beautiful Glencairn glasses there. So go ahead, bring it up to your nose. And again, you think about that approachability that we talked about, right? Right on the nose. It's light. It's approachable. You get that little bit of like spiciness, little hint of oak, vanilla coming through. Nothing too bold, nothing too assertive, and that's what we're looking for, right? We're just looking for this lovely, approachable whiskey.
It's very rounded, is what it is.
Very rounded. And then I know we all taste whiskeys different ways, and one of the techniques I like, and I can certainly walk you through it, or you can taste it the way you want. I'll just kind of tell you what I love to do. I always love to take a little sip, kind of just hold it in the center of my mouth, kind of like move it cheek to cheek, bring it forward in the mouth, push it up to the roof of the mouth, and then, swallow it, draw that nice little breath in across the tongue, close my mouth, breathe out through my nose, really get that whole experience.
You want to let the whiskey touch your whole palate.
Yeah, really just, just kind of let it experience everything. That way we're getting it on ourselves. We can both just do that together. Oh, wow. Creamy, vanilla.
Very creamy. I love that little bit of spice right on the back.
Oh, yeah.
Nice and sweet, but not too sweet.
Yeah, it's that perfect balance. It's that creaminess. It's that mouthfeel. It's that little spice, that oak, that nice little bit of vanilla coming through. And you're absolutely right. Like, there's a sweetness to it, but it's not overly sweet. It's just, to me, it's the perfect balance. That, what we're tasting, that's a testament to both the whiskey that we distill and the skill of our blenders being able to select the right whiskeys. It's that entire team working together to really create something quite lovely, like we have in Deluxe.
So talk a little bit about the blenders. How is Canadian whiskey made differently? How is this blended made differently than American whiskey?
So what we do at Crown Royal is we actually produce five. We'll call them distillates to get us started, right? We produce 5 different distillates. We produce 2 corn whiskeys, which are distilled slightly different, both on column stills, but just slightly different. One's going to give us just a very clean, very light flavor, and that's going to really give us the base. And then the other one, which is more of kind of a batch whiskey process, is going to give us a lot of that creaminess. It's going to give us this kind of like almost like butterscotch, juicy fruit kind of beautiful, beautiful mouthfeel. So we're going to have those 2 whiskeys. Those are going to be aged in previously used oak barrels.
Okay.
So what we'll do is we'll bring in brand new American oak barrels to the distillery, and we're going to keep them in our family and just keep using them as many times as we can. But with those corn whiskeys, we're going to put those in the previously seasoned barrels because we're really just looking for the wood to impart some nice subtle flavors, some nice subtle color. But we really, again, these are going to be the foundation. These are going to be the building blocks as we start to build our blend. From there, we're going to produce a bourbon style whiskey. It's obviously in Canada. We're not going to call it bourbon, but the mash bill would be a traditional bourbon mash bill, about 2/3 corn, 1/3 rye. With that, we're going to get those nice floral notes, the grainier notes. We're going to start to draw on some of those kind of vanilla notes from the oak casks.
Sure.
We're going to produce a rye whiskey that's about 95% rye. And that's where we're going to get those baking spices, right? The clove, the nutmeg, a little hint of that sweetness and that dryness. And then we're going to produce a whiskey that is very near and dear to my heart, which is our coffee rye. So it's going to come off our coffee still, and we can kind of get into distillation at some point. But I always tell folks it has nothing to do with your favorite local coffee house. It's just the type of distillation method. Rye in Canada is always kind of been slang for whiskey. So a lot of times folks will say rye, and it's not rye as we think here in the United States. So even with that particular coffee rye, it's more of a traditional bourbon mash bill. But what's unique about that coffee rye and that coffee distillation, it gives us this beautiful whiskey that almost has a chocolatey banana quality to it, with this beautiful spiciness shining through. So,
and that's the whiskey that's being used for the hand-selected barrel, correct?
For the hand-selected barrel. So that's our single barrel. And again, that comes from folks tasting that and saying, man, this should be a whiskey on its own. I feel that way about all the whiskeys I just described to you because they're all so unique and they're all so lovely on their own. And down the road, I would hope that maybe we start to see that. I don't know. It's certainly something that I would push for. And if you and I can ever taste some of those together, we certainly will because they're quite lovely. But so with the coffee rye, we're going to use brand new American oak. With the bourbon or the bourbon style in the rye, we're going to use a majority of brand new oak, and then we'll use some previously seasoned oak as well. And the idea now is we're going to let those sleep. We're going to let them rest. So with Canadian whiskey, minimum of 3 years. we're going to let them rest a whole heck of a lot longer than that. Really let that whiskey work itself in and out of the wood. Let them develop those unique personalities. That's when we turned it over to the blenders, because now for the blenders, it's about maintaining the consistency of Crown Royal. So what you and I are tasting tonight, if we have a little reunion in 6 months, it's going to taste the same. It better taste the same.
Sure.
But and that's first and foremost what they're going to do. They're going to, what whiskeys do they need? What do they need to pull from what we have available to make sure that Crown Royal tastes like Crown Royal? Then, as we're going to find when we get to Reserve and we get to the Noble Collection and the Cornerstone that you have, that's when the blenders start to have a little fun. They can start saying, "Oh, well, let's try this, let's try that." And we're going to see that as we kind of move down the line with Crown Royal. We're going to see a lot more of that as well. So, if we distill all of those whiskeys correctly, or those distillates correctly, we put them in the exact type of wood that we need them to, and our maturation department is fantastic at that. And then we turn it over to the very talented hands of our blenders. Then we end up with this lovely whiskey that you and I get to experience on a Monday night. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, but
sure.
Fascinating.
I always, people down here usually give blenders sort of a kind of an evil eye, or compared to Scotland or
right.
But I don't hear too much about blenders in Canada so much. Now it seems like, I don't know, the last year or two, I've seen a lot more Canadian whiskeys come out on the market. I don't know. I mean, obviously I know why, because it tastes great. But is there a reason for a sudden influx in Canadian whiskeys?
I think more and more people are discovering whiskey as a category in general. And I think when you look at, for example, Northern Harvest Rye getting the recognition that Jim Murray gave it with the World Whiskey of the Year, when you look at what some of our other Canadian whiskey brands are doing, they're really, people are taking that second look at Canadian whiskey. And I think, and it's a conversation that I've been having a lot recently, just not only with my colleagues, but with friends that work on other brands, and with just whiskey folks who enjoy whiskey like you and I. It's kind of our job, it's our responsibility to really get out there and talk more about Canadian whiskey, and talk about the fact that yes, it's approachable and it's creamy and it's vanilla and it doesn't have to be big and bold and all these things, right. And then to talk about that artistry and that craftsmanship. When it comes to blending, I can tell you a very, very quick little story. Years ago, before I really dedicated all of my time to Crown, so this would have probably been like 2009, 2010, I visited Gimli as part of an education trip that I was on. And so Gimli's up in Manitoba, about an hour north of Winnipeg, and that's where we produce all the whiskey for Crown Royal now. But when I walked in, there was a bottle of Crown Royal Deluxe, and it was surrounded by around 50 different little, like 100 milliliter bottles.
Sure.
And I honestly just remember staring at it. And you have to remember, I was working on Scotch whiskey at the time. So I was staring at it. And this gentleman came up behind me and said, "You trying to figure out what that is, right?" I said, "Well, if we were in Scotland and this was a blend, I would assume it's all the parts of the blend." And he said, "Well, you're not in Scotland, you're in Canada. That is all the parts of the blend. And what you're going to learn in the next few hours is that we make them all right here in Gimli." And it just, again, I had that aha moment,
Sort of like Japanese whiskey, where if they're like Yamazaki, they're making all these different styles of whiskey because they can't go to the other distilleries to go buy some malts or whatever they're making, whatever distillate they're making, because until now they're not a lot to trade with or to buy from, so they have to make all these different styles.
Exactly.
So that's sort of how I imagine this is. We make all these different styles, and
yeah. And it's one of those things too. We make all those different styles, and they can all stand alone on their own. But it's always, for me, blending has always been about creating something that's greater than the sum of its parts.
Sure.
And so when you have these fantastic whiskeys, and then you can start to blend them together and create these layers and create this lovely music, this musicality to it almost, then it takes it to the next level.
Well, it's like and I might get slack for saying this, but I always thought of distilling as a science and blending as an art.
That's just,
but
you know, you're not going to get no one should ever slap you for saying it. No one should ever slap you because you have a beard. We look out for each other. But no,
yours is coming in much better than mine.
It's just you're not enough whiskey. I don't know for you.
Although we have the same gray hair in the same spot.
Yes, during the holidays this year, my nephew wanted to know, Uncle Stephen, why do you paint your beard white? Yeah, I just I was like, thanks, thank you, thanks. But and there's you embrace it, Bobby. There's nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with it. But I've always phrased that the exact same way you just phrased it. And in fact, if you go back and probably look at PowerPoint presentations I did in 2006, 2007, I always said distillation is a science and blending is an art. And it really is at the end of the day. And it's the combination of those two things that create not only Crown Royal, but some of the beautiful blended whiskeys that we have out there.
Sure. Well, blended is not a bad word.
What's that? Blending is not a bad word at all. Not a bad word at all. Do you want to dive into the Crown Black?
Let's jump into it. So talk about Crown Black.
I was going to say, do we want to go Crown Black or do we want to go Crown Reserve first? Let's go Crown Black because you have some water there, right?
I do have some water.
So let's go Crown Black, and then we'll come back to the Reserve, and then we'll finish everything off with.
Because I noticed this is bottled at 45% compared to 40%.
Yeah, it's got a little more power to it, a little more personality. So the idea behind Crown Black, just to kind of give you a little background on it, for a very long time, when you look at Crown Deluxe and Crown Reserve, that's over on the other side of Black there. Those were the only two blends, really, that Crown Royal focused on. We were enjoying Crown Royal in the mid '90s. It was pretty much that was our two choices. Of course, the XR series came out around 2006. The very first one, the Waterloo XR, and then Crown Black came out soon after that. And with Crown Black, it was kind of us looking at creating a whiskey that was a little more bourbon focused.
Sure.
Bourbon was on the rise at that time. Bourbon's still on the rise, of course. 90 proof whiskey. I used to laugh. I said, no one. I'm a country music fan, and I said, no one ever writes songs about 80 proof whiskey. They write songs about 90 proof whiskey. Although I feel like now every time I listen to the radio, Crown Royal's mentioned in about every other country song, and I absolutely love that. Trust me, puts a big smile. It's a huge smile on my face. But so that was the thing is we looked at from a blending standpoint. We said, well, let's create a blend, or our blenders said, let's create a blend that really highlights those bourbon style notes. It focuses more on that. So we can get, and you're probably picking it up on the nose, you're getting more maple. You're getting those deeper oak notes. There's a richness just on the nose to this whiskey.
Yeah, it's a lot more robust. And
a lot more robust.
How much of it's proof, or how much is it is being partially aged in more, is it aged in more charred oak barrels?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a heavier char on the barrels. We're also, this blend is going to have a lot more of that new oak influence. So when you think about like the bourbon, the rye, and the coffee rye that we were talking about, majority of that being in new American oak, we're definitely going to see a lot more new American oak on this blend. And that's going to give us that a little more personality as well.
Wow, that's good. Yeah, there's a lot more oak spice, a little bit drier, and just a lot more robust in general. I do get a little bit more of the kind of the maple or caramel side of things, but it's just like the standard Crown. It's not like I get maple syrup, but it's not syrupy. It's not it's not very sweet. It's not cloying.
Again, it's that perfect balance of there's that little bit of sweetness, there's that little bit of creaminess, but it doesn't go too far. It doesn't go too far in the direction of.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely a member of the Crown family. Just tasting it, but I see the sort of the American barrel or the American bourbon influence on it.
I still remember when we launched this whiskey. In fact, I was fortunate enough to be part of some of the early events we did with it back then, and I think I remember one event we were doing where I basically had a small sample bottle, kind of underneath the table, as often we do at whiskey festivals and things. We might have something special, and I remember, being able to share it with quite a few folks that evening, and everyone had that same reaction, like, "Oh, when can I get a full bottle? Oh, wow!" And it's always a lot of fun to be able to do that, and so it's one that I go back to quite often. Certainly, I've experimented and enjoyed, responsibly enjoyed, of course. Quite a few cocktails over the years using Crown Black, because it does have that bolder flavor, it has that richer flavor.
In terms of cocktails, I like drinking most of my whiskey straight, but occasionally I'll make an old fashioned or a Sazerac with the rye or whatever I may want. But I always reach for a whiskey that's a little bit higher in proof, a little bit more robust, because for me, a cocktail is supposed to be complementing whatever flavors the whiskey might bring. It's not about all the stuff I'm adding to it. It's about the whiskey. The whiskey should be the star, I think. And a whiskey that's a little higher in proof or just a little bit more robust in flavor, I always think stands out a little bit better, makes for a better cocktail.
Well, we're definitely cut from the same cloth when it comes to that, because to me, and I've had this discussion with people over the years, I think you can take any whiskey and make a cocktail. And then some folks will say certain whiskeys you shouldn't make cocktails with, but it's like, I love to cook.
Although I did have a Port Ellen Old Fashioned last year at Tales. Sacrilege, but it was delicious.
It was look, I probably won't mention some of the cocktails I've had over the years, since we're focusing on Crown Royal tonight. But between two guys who enjoy whiskey and everyone watching who enjoys whiskey, we've all had, I'm sure, some very unique things over the years. Port Ellen Old Fashioned would be a prime example of something you would say, "What?" And then you go, "This is really, really delicious." But I feel the same way. Like, to me, a cocktail should showcase and highlight the whiskey that you've chosen. So yes, you can make a cocktail with Crown Black. You can make a cocktail with Crown Royal Reserve. In fact, Crown Royal Reserve is one of my. It is. I always, I don't want to say it's my go-to whiskey, because I always say it's kind of like my nieces and nephew, right? I don't want to pick a favorite. I don't want to call a favorite out. Do I have
my children, but nieces and nephews sounds a little bit better.
Yeah. Do I have a favorite? Yes, of course I have a favorite. That's the way it is. But Crown Royal Reserve has always been a very special whiskey for me, and I often will make my Manhattans with that. I will make an old fashioned with that. I'll enjoy it neat. I'll enjoy it on the rocks. It's one of those whiskeys very versatile, as we'll taste here in a second. But every cocktail I enjoy with Crown Royal, I always think about the whiskey first. Sure. What's gonna kind of highlight, what's gonna build upon what I'm already enjoying and what I already enjoy. So I'm right there with you when it comes to it.
Fantastic. Let's jump into Crown Royal Reserve.
Let's taste a little Reserve. I realize most of my bottles are full on the display, except for the Reserve, which I have. What's
the bottle you have over your right shoulder, all the way in the back? Was it Cask 16?
Yeah, a little something from the museum there, a little like Cask 16.
You don't see that around too often here.
You do not.
I don't think it was a U.S. release, was it?
It was, but it's a whiskey, and it's very similar to Crown Royal XO. It was finished in cognac casks, so it's a similar idea, slightly different other than that. But it was one of those whiskeys that it was around for a very short period of time, and so every now and then I still get folks that ask. In fact, if anyone's watching, hopefully my address is not published, because I know people that would probably try to seek me out to find. Maybe I should just put that away.
Put that away, right? So tell me a little bit about Crown Royal Reserve. What's different compared to the standard one?
The idea for Reserve, this actually really ties in the new campaign for Crown Royal, and I don't know if you've had a chance to see some of the new commercials and new spots. It's about generosity. So the idea is live generously, and life will treat you royally. And I remember the first time the team shared that campaign with me, and they said, this is the new idea. This is what we're going to do. And I just had the biggest smile on my face, because to me, that's how we should live life. If we live generous, especially I'm here in New York. I was on the subway on the way home to sit down, and so many people. And it's like, I'm always polite, let people go up the stairs, hold the door, all the things you try to do just to be generous in life. And so I love that idea of incorporating that into a campaign for a very, you know, iconic whiskey brand. Crown Royal Reserve, though, the idea for Reserve came from that back in the 90s. It was a gift. It was a gift to those who were already enjoying Crown Royal. It was a thank you from our blenders at that time to say, here's something a little different. Here's something special. We've tapped into some of our older reserves. We focused a little more on the bourbon style, the rye, the coffee rye, and we're basically just taking that Crown Royal Deluxe that you love. We're kind of just taking it up a little bit, and it's our way of saying thank you.
Sure.
And so for me, Crown Royal Reserve has always been that. So I love the fact that now we're really focused on that generosity campaign, which is incredible, especially right now. I think it's very important. And then this is a whiskey that really embodies that idea as well.
And then even in a more very specific definition of that, you know, whiskey drinkers, whiskey guys are very generous with their whiskey. Whiskey's meant to be shared.
Absolutely.
You know, it's nothing sadder than a guy just hanging out by himself, just drinking a glass of whiskey.
I've always said I don't believe in whiskey museums. You know, if I have a bottle of whiskey and you came over and you said, well, what's that? I would say, well, let's open it up and have some. And if there was 10 of us, I would want all 10 of us. I mean, I think that's how whiskey is. I've always said whiskey brings folks together.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you might like a single malt. I might like Crown Royal. Your wife maybe likes a nice peated whiskey or a blended Scotch. My wife, we're going to all be enjoying a great whiskey, and whiskey is going to bring us together. We're going to have good conversation and good times, and that's at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. So the Reserve, again, on the nose, it's going to be, to me, you get like nutmeg. You start to get some of that baking spice coming through. There's that little bit of nice. It's a little bit of a more softer oak. It's spent a little bit more time in the wood. You still get some nice vanilla notes coming through.
It does smell a bit richer.
And it makes sense. We're looking at the blend itself is going to be a little older. We're looking at more focus on what I would consider the flavoring whiskeys, the bourbon style, the rye, the coffee rye.
Yeah, I think you're right. Oh, that's good. There's a nice like vanilla cream right at the end.
Yeah,
that's really good. Yeah, it seems a bit sort of richer than the standard blend, which is already sort of creamy to begin with.
Right.
But it's almost like, you know, half and half, and you know, whipping cream, in a sense. But yeah, I see what you're saying with some of the baking spices, but it's not like, you know, spicy cinnamon like you get in some rye whiskeys, or this, you know, like sharp grain spice or anything. It's kind of just soft. It's almost like some sort of custard with some sort of you know, baking spices. Kind of want to mix into
great way to describe it. And it goes back to what we were talking about too, where this is a Canadian whiskey. We still want it to be approachable. We still want this to be a whiskey that you pick up and you can enjoy neat, or with a little bit of water or ice, or make a cocktail out of it. And much like Crown Royal Deluxe was a gift for the king and queen, this was a gift for those who were already enjoying Crown Royal.
Sure.
So that idea, that generosity, the idea is still, you know, it still carries through.
What's the price point on the three, generally speaking?
I would say just generally, because, you know, obviously different
markets. Sure.
The Deluxe is usually around the $30 mark, a little less, a little more, but just let's call it that. Black is usually just around that same price, slightly a little bit more. And then with Reserve, I've seen it fluctuate, but I always put it around the $45 mark. You know, and some of mine might be based on New York prices, and I know down in NOLA, you might be able to get a little bit of a better deal. And then just
you do okay.
What's that?
You do okay in prices.
You do okay.
You do all right. I've got no complaints.
You do enjoy some good Crown Royal down there for sure.
Yeah, this is fantastic stuff. I know as soon as this is over, I'm going to get a phone call from my dad asking me to bring these bottles over.
Well, as he should, especially if he's already a Crown Royal fan.
He's a big Crown Royal fan. I think he was most excited to hear about this, our next whiskey in the lineup.
This is a whiskey, you know, it's one of those things I will tell you. So I already, as we talked about, you know, 25 minutes ago, I think I already had such a love and kind of this affection for Crown Royal. Then as I started to really focus my energy and my time on Crown, it was, you know, right as we were, you know, releasing the single barrel, the hand selected barrel, the Northern Harvest Rye. This is a whiskey that I knew was in development at that time as well, that we were thinking about. And it was like, these are the whiskeys, as a whiskey lover, first and foremost, that I just get super excited about.
And you can see I'm opening for the first time here.
Well, the fact that that's what I love, you know, something you had told me that you were going to taste this for the first time, and the fact that you were just now opening this bottle, which I know it's been sitting in your house for at least a couple of days, if not longer. That is some serious.
I was pretty tempted over the weekend.
Yeah, that's some serious discipline. So I salute you. Kudos to you on that.
I love the bottle.
It's an absolute gorgeous bottle. You know, it's one of those things where from the canister and the packaging that it's in, to the velvet bag, to the shape and design of that bottle, they're all just absolutely stunning. And then when we get to the liquid, which we're getting ready to get to, the liquid just brings it all together. The liquid brings it home for me. So the idea with this, so our Noble series is actually going to be a series of whiskeys. So it's exciting, especially again for those of us who we're all whiskey fans first and foremost. We love whiskey. We love to say, well, what's next? What can we do? So we're going to have an entire series, and what we're going to do is every year we're going to release a new member, a new friend into that series. But these are going to be limited releases. So it's a whiskey that we're going to see it, we're going to enjoy it, we're going to share it with friends and have good conversation, and then it's going to be gone. And we're going to probably talk about it, like, oh, remember when we had, and then the next one will be around. So
sure.
The Cornerstone Blend is how we wanted to launch that series. This is the way we're starting the series. So the idea with Cornerstone, and I always kind of say it's a little bit, hold on one second. So I got to give a little shout out to my good friend Dwayne Kozlowski, who for many, many years was the quality manager at Crown Royal. So a lot of the Crown Royal whiskey that we are tasting, he knows that whiskey when it was distilled. He evaluated that whiskey before it was blended. And he has shifted to a new role. And I won't disclose that right this second, but he's still part of the family. But a very, very just amazing human being. And he just texted me that he too has a bottle of Cask 16.
Oh, you bastards.
So Dwayne, we know.
Dwayne, nice job on the control, quality control on these. Very nice job.
Yeah, Dwayne's father worked at the distillery in Gimli. Dwayne worked there. Dwayne moved into that quality control role. And so when I took on my role as national brand ambassador, I got to spend a lot of time with him. And yeah, he knows this, of course, but I can't thank him enough. But when I taste these whiskeys, I always think about folks like Dwayne. I think about folks like his dad. I think about it's all the people who've had a hand in making these whiskeys incredible as they are. But so with Cornerstone, this whiskey, there's a couple of different ways we could look at this. This whiskey, in a way, it was a little bit of us planning ahead. So we produce a lot of whiskey in Gimli, and what we'll do is we'll pre-blend that whiskey together after it's matured, and then we'll move that whiskey down to where it gets bottled and ultimately put together, that you and I get to sit back and enjoy it. So we kind of realized that we needed a little bit of a backup plan because, you know, if something happens, we certainly want to make sure we have enough whiskey on different areas to still create all the Crown Royal blends. That's first and foremost. So what we did is we created a blend that was comprised of our flavoring whiskeys that we call them. So it's our bourbon style, our rye, and our coffee rye. We put that on a rail car because we do ship everything via rail. And I always say, like, these are cars that are dedicated to us. The only thing that's ever been in them is Crown Royal. I can't identify them, so don't ask me if I can. But I will tell you, when I see a train going through Canada, I'm always thinking,
I always wonder.
There might be some delicious Crown Royal whiskey inside one of those. But this is a blend that was put together It was shipped down to Quebec, actually, outside of Montreal. And it ended up being rebarreled for a short period of time, which is something we generally wouldn't do.
Mhm.
So now we've taken this blend that's already matured on its own, been blended together. We've moved it. We've then kind of put that back into wood. So now it's getting a little bit of a second maturation, if you will. So something magical, something different is happening there. That ended up, long story short, that ended up getting sent back up to Gimli. So we kind of went through that process, went through another process. And this was all for us basically to create a plan in case anything ever happened. But somewhere along this back and forth, it was tasted and someone said, well, wow, this is really lovely. This is unique. We'll never be able to replicate this, but this is fantastic. And so it just seemed like it was the absolute perfect whiskey to launch the Noble series with, because these whiskeys are the cornerstone. That's what all the whiskeys we have tasted tonight. These are the whiskeys, when we talk about the corn whiskeys really being our building blocks and our foundation, these are those whiskeys that come in and really give that personality to Crown Royal. So I often say it's, and I can use a prime example of this. There's a little brewery that I love here in Queens, and they do some really crazy beers. And oftentimes I'll go in and there'll be something on draft, and I'll come back 2 weeks later and it's gone. They're like, oh, that was kind of an experiment, and we'll never be able to replicate it, but I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Sure.
And I always bring them a little whiskey, of course, as well. And I've actually told them with the Noble series, for us, the Noble series, especially Cornerstone, it wasn't an experiment, but it was something that was born out of something else. And because of that, we ended up with a really unique and a very, very, very special whiskey. So, but anyway, I've talked so much, and tell me what your thoughts are. I'll stop talking for a minute, Bobby, and you can.
First of all, I love the nose on this thing. This is fantastic.
It's like cherry pie. I don't know if you picked that up. It's like this deep, rich kind of almost.
It is a bit fruitier. It is a bit spicier. It's I can get some citrus, like some orange.
Mm-hmm.
Some baking spice. It's really good.
And you think about the flavors, right? You think about that bourbon style that we talked about, the rye that we talked about, the single barrel, the coffee rye that we've talked about. And again, these are those whiskeys that are forming that backbone of what will be Crown Deluxe, what will be Crown Reserve.
It's a lot spicier than I thought it would be.
Mm-hmm.
Really good. I get that grain, that rye grain really comes out. To me, from memory, because I haven't tasted it in a while, but to me, that's even a bit spicier at 40.3%. Than the Northern Harvest Rye. Like the grain note is just really showcased in here.
It is, and from a blending standpoint, it makes perfect sense that you would pick that up, because with this whiskey, those base whiskeys that we talked about, right? The corn whiskeys that we produce, they give Crown that creaminess, that like butterscotch juicy fruit quality that we talk about. They're not going to be in this blend. So this blend is strictly those flavoring whiskeys. It's that bourbon style, that rye, that coffee rye. Whereas the Northern Harvest Rye still has some of that, kind of giving that whiskey that bit of creaminess, and it softens a little of that spiciness. Whereas this, we're really getting the full flavor of the whiskey.
It does still retain some of the creaminess, but it's, for me, the Crown Royal Reserve was sort of the richest of them. This one is sort of the spiciest, but it's also got so many. Everything sort of comes together better, I think, with the Cornerstone Blend. I do taste the rye. I do taste sort of that, not a corn whiskey, but sort of like the bourbon style.
Bourbon style, right?
It's really, really nice. Really nice. It's got a great mouthfeel, especially at 40%. I always come into into a 40% or 80 proof whiskey with a negative notion that, oh, it's going to be thin. It's going to be, no, not this one.
I love to hear you say that. And I remember when we launched this, and one of our blenders who has since retired, I just remember him and I really talking a lot about the whole process on how this whiskey came to be. And And it really was like I described to you. It was kind of like, well, we have this, and we're going to move it here, and we're going to move it here, and then, oh, that's something lovely has happened there. But to be able to replicate that would take a lot of time, and so now we have this whiskey that we get to enjoy, and it's a great way, as I said, to launch that noble series that we're going to continue to see different releases from.
And sort of like the black, there is like a kind of that oak really shows up on the finish. It's a little bit drier, a little spicier, oak spice instead of grain spice, I think. But
it was
a fantastic job.
Well, if Dwayne's still watching, which I know he is, he can take. I think we can give him some kudos on that one, because I know he had a nose, literally, in on that blend from the start. But
what's the price point on this guy?
Usually it's around $60.
Oh wow, that's
so
really good price.
Again, it's approachable. I'm always very sensitive of pricing and things, but to me, it's an affordable whiskey. And when you look at the quality of the whiskey, it's second to none. I mean, all the whiskeys we've tasted tonight, the quality is, to me, is always front and center. And then that starts again. If we had more time and we got into it, it would start with the grains that we bring into the distillery and the quality checks that before the corn's even unloaded, or the barley or the rye is unloaded, the quality checks that they go through before they even begin the whiskey making process. And so from grain to glass, it's just a lot of folks, a lot of talented folks and hardworking folks who take a lot of pride in making our whiskeys.
I'm assuming one thing you do when you go up to the distillery up there is you get to taste the individual component whiskeys for this separately.
I do.
I bet that's a fantastic experience. And then going in and tasting the final product.
I remember the first time I experienced it. I remember the first time since I took on this role, and every time I have an opportunity to sit with any of our folks at the distillery, any of our blending team, there's always something to be learned. But to be able to sit down and taste those distillates, okay, let me taste what that tastes like before we put it in wood. Now let me taste it at 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years. Let me taste the bourbon and the rye and the coffee rye blended together before that gets blended in with it. To be able to experience that. And at some point, I hope that you and I can experience that together, because it really does. Again, it showcases that quality. It showcases the craftsmanship that really makes these whiskeys that we've tasted together tonight, makes them possible. So yeah, I'm lucky. I'm just, as a whiskey lover first, I'm lucky to be able to do what I do, and I absolutely enjoy it, hands down.
It's like, the best job in the world.
I think so. I don't know what would be better, really. I mean, we get to talk about whiskey. We get to share whiskey. We've had great conversations and meet just, incredible people in the process, and it's fantastic.
Now you mentioned this is the first of a new limited release. It's going to change every year.
It will.
Can you give us a little tease as to what we're going to see in 2017?
Yeah, I think it's safe to give you a little tease. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, I should be down in New Orleans at some point in the next week or two, and if I am, I will certainly perhaps bring a little sample bottle, a little gift. But yeah, so what we're going to see, and probably around April, we don't have the official launch date yet.
Sure.
But we're gonna start thinking about different finishes. So what we're going to see is we're going to see a whiskey that has been finished in wine barrels. We're looking at a California red wine. I've tasted it. I have a couple little samples left here in the apartment, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So it's the perfect next addition to the Noble series. It's a lovely follow-up to the Cornerstone Blend, and I think it's going to give you an idea of now what we can start doing as we continue this series, as far as looking at second maturations, looking at different types of wood, perhaps even looking down the road at different mash bills, looking at different grains down the road. I mean, the possibilities really are endless, and it's going to be much like the little brewery that I was talking about here in Queens. It's going to be a lot of that. Well, let's experiment. What does this do? How does this work? Oh, let's do that. And so I really love the direction that our team is going. And again, we just have some incredible people who, that's what they just come up with these ideas. And they're like, well, let's try this. That really works. And so with this, we're taking Crown Royal Deluxe. So the first whiskey that we started with tonight, we're doing the second maturation in the wine barrels. And again, they're going to be red wine. They're Cabernet barrels, I believe. I just double checked that, but they're Cabernet barrels from California, doing a second maturation in those. And the results are absolutely stunning. It's a big whiskey. Get these lovely kind of juicy wine notes coming through. The way I actually described it is it's almost like a Manhattan. As soon as you take a sip, it just has all those flavors. So we're getting that creaminess, we're getting those Crown Royal flavors, and we're getting that nice rich wine influence as well. So that's a little tease.
More to sold already.
More to come.
I'm a big fan of wine cask finished whiskeys. Yeah. I know Angel's Envy is kind of one of the big wine cask port finish bourbons here in the States. Over in Scotland, there's countless wine finish cask, but when done right, they can be stunning whiskeys.
It's amazing. I always think about. I was very lucky for a long time to work with one of our blenders in Scotland, and I just remember on another whiskey that's part of the family. But I just remember him and I talking about flavor and where flavor comes from, and how important wood is in selecting the right wood, especially when you have this great distillate. And then when you start looking at those second maturations and saying, okay, we have this. Well, what can we bring in now? Is it a sherry cask? Is it a port cask? Is it a Madeira? What are the choices? How will that play? How will that manipulate the flavor? And I love the fact that now we're looking at that, cask 16 that we talked about earlier, and Crown XO, that was cognac casks. Mm-hmm. So we've already been looking at that idea and experimenting with that, and we've done it very, very well. Now to branch out and start looking at different types of wine barrels, and we're just looking at this year. What's next year? What's the year after that?
Sure. There's always, I guess, the chance of it becoming a giant hit, and the team thinking, well, could this be a new addition to our standard lineup?
Yeah. I think when you and this is just kind of me speaking again as a fan of whiskey, when you start looking at finishes, it does provide more opportunity to create something that could be long lasting. Whereas something like Cornerstone that we've already kind of talked about would be a little harder, a little more challenging to replicate. If we start getting into finishes, we really could say, okay, man, everybody, really, Stephen and Bobby loved it. We got to keep making it. And there would be a possibility to do that. But I know looking down the road, I've tasted a few things. I've certainly had some great conversations, and as a whiskey, I'm excited.
So I'm assuming some of the stuff next year or the year after is going to be pretty tasty.
We're gonna have some fun. Let's put that. We're gonna have some fun. Really enjoyable whiskeys.
Now, is it a challenge for you guys? Because you guys have your standard lineup, so you have to have enough whiskey to blend together for these things, and you can find this anywhere. It's everyone knows about it. And then you've got the rest of the lineup. Are you guys taxed in terms of how the distillery is running? Are you guys, capacity?
Again, going back to the team that we have in Gimli, we have an incredible team. And one of the things that I've enjoyed, especially over the last year and a half, is spending time there and just getting to know people who work there, getting to know the team better. And so, you can sit with one of our distillery operators and we have a couple of folks who have been there 30 plus years, and like I mentioned, Dwayne's dad worked there. So you have some families that have continued the tradition. Our distillery, we're producing whiskey 24/7. Mm-hmm. There is someone at the distillery, there is whiskey being produced or distillate being produced. It is a huge challenge because as the brand continues to grow, and as we add more members of the Crown Royal family, that's where things kind of get turned over to the blenders to say, okay, well, this is what you have available. We have to make sure Deluxe and Black and Reserve and Northern Harvest Rye and XO, we have to make sure those whiskeys are still available. But at the same time, we also want the next member of the Noble series. Perhaps we have a Crown Vanilla or Crown Apple, or maybe we'll do a Crown Honey like we did last summer. We have to make sure we have the whiskeys for those.
And one thing you have going for you is none of your whiskeys have age statements, which is, I know, one of those hot topic issues amongst a lot of whiskey diehards.
Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about, well, we can only use something aged 6 or 8 years or whatever your average age might be. You can kind of play around a little bit as long as it's about the flavor.
Right, and that's the thing, and that comes back to the basic principles of blending, that at the end of the day, it's about creating a consistent flavor. So we want to make sure Deluxe tastes like Deluxe and Black tastes like Black year in and year out. And it may be challenging some years. Some years we might have to say, well, we don't have whiskey A available to us, or we don't have enough. So we may have to say, well, whiskey, I don't know, we'll call it a H and J. We have enough of those to make up for what we're lacking in A, and it's the basic principles of blending. But we're also having to do that, and we're having to think about cost and all these things so that when we walk into a store, we walk into our favorite bar, you and I, we know what we expect to pay for a glass of Crown Royal or a bottle of Crown Royal, and we want to keep that honest as well. So There's a lot of factors. I always tell folks, I have I think the easiest of all the jobs at Crown Royal, because I get to just sit down and I get to talk about this whiskey and share this whiskey and tell the great stories of the folks that I meet. As much as I would love to be on the financial side of it, because it fascinates the heck out of me, I'm really thankful that I just get to sit down and talk about it, because there's a lot, like I said, there's a big team. There's a lot of folks that are having to think about those things and look 8 years, 10 years, 12 years down the road.
Yeah, you do have the better end of the deal here.
I do, and there's probably some folks watching that are going, yeah, he does. I may get a few notes about that, but I'd love to see us, as a wish list thing. I'd love to see us do an age statement at some point for fun. We certainly have some older whiskeys that are part of our inventory. Could we do a Noble series that's an age statement? I don't know. I mean, these are ideas. But blending without an age statement, and I think anyone in Scotland will tell you this, in Ireland, anyone who blends whiskey will tell you, when you do remove the age statement, it does give you more freedom. It gives you more flexibility.
And at the end of the day, it's all about what's in the glass.
Exactly. And again, going back to one of the Scottish blenders I learned from, he would always be quick to tell me, Stephen, sometimes a whiskey's perfect at 8 years. And that same whiskey at 10 years, it's not quite what it was. So I want some of that 8-year-old whiskey. And then I'm going to bring in some 15-year-old, and then I'll bring in a little of this. And we do the same thing. We certainly have barrels that have been in our warehouse for a considerable amount of time, which have developed incredible flavor. We can use those. We can bring in some of the younger whiskeys. We can bring in some of those middle-aged whiskeys, for lack of a better term. And that's what we're going to create that consistency in the blend.
So speaking of older whiskeys, and it makes me think of sometimes closed distilleries. Let's run through maybe the rest of the Crown Royal lineup. And I want to start with Crown Royal XR.
Sure.
I know there have been 2 releases of that. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you kind of go back into the history of Crown Royal, so kind of go back into the 1939 Crown Royal being created for the first time. At that time, there were several distilleries throughout Canada, and even up until like mid to late 80s, early 90s, there were several distilleries that were producing different whiskeys that were part of the Crown Royal family. So with XR, the idea was to kind of go back and say, well, it's going to be our extra rare series. What can we do to launch this series? So we started with using some of the remaining whiskeys from our Waterloo distillery. So Waterloo Distillery was in Ontario, and this would have been, when you look at some of the whiskeys that were in that original Crown Royal in 1939, a lot of those whiskeys most likely would have come from that Waterloo Distillery based on proximity and where the distillery was, at the time where the blending was happening. Mm-hmm. So we created a blend using some of the remaining whiskeys from that distillery. So that distillery itself closed down in the early 90s, unfortunately also caught on fire and burnt down soon after. So it's, you know, the lot is still there. There's offices still there, but the distillery itself is no longer there. But we were able to take those whiskeys, which we had already moved, create a blend around those, bringing in some of the whiskeys from Gimli, and really creating something quite lovely. And so we launched that around 2006. And then we knew there would be a point where we no longer have that whiskey available to us. So it became, well, do we end it there, or do we create another whiskey? And at the time, our blender, Andrew Mackay, was LaSalle has always been important to him. That's where he started his career. That's where our blending team is currently based.
Sure.
So that was another distillery that was a huge part of the Crown Royal history. So that distillery was also closed in the early 90s. It did not burn down, though. Someone was asking me about this the other day. I said, no, we just happened to close them around the same time. That distillery, though, now has been demolished. So it is no longer there either. So we have two distilleries that are part of the history that are no longer available. But we created a blend around those LaSalle whiskeys. What were our remaining stocks of whiskey from LaSalle? Slightly different flavor profile, because we're looking at the bulk of the whiskeys are coming from two different distilleries. So even though they were producing similar whiskeys as far as kind of the mash bills and the distillation techniques,
always going to be a little bit different.
Exactly. And you know that, and everyone watching knows that there's always going to be this slight variation.
Someone on Twitter earlier was asking me if the Waterloo XR was any good, because they've had a bottle for a while and they didn't know if they should open it or not.
You know, it's one of those whiskeys, like I never tell folks what to do with their whiskey. Again, it goes back to what you and I talked about. I always say whiskey is meant to be enjoyed. It's meant to be shared. But there are folks that love to hold on to whiskey. So if you're holding on to a bottle of the Waterloo, I'd be more than happy to open it and share it with you, because I think at this point, I don't think I have a bottle at this point. I think I actually opened and shared my last bottle of the Waterloo. It's a fantastic whiskey because, to me, the LaSalle whiskey is a very similar flavor profile to what we expect from Crown Royal. But I find the Waterloo whiskey to be a little different. I feel like there's more honey. There's more of a little bit of a different fruitiness to that whiskey, a little bit different personality. But again, it comes down to what do you want to do with your whiskey? I mean,
sure.
I have plenty of folks that always ask me, where can they find a bottle of Waterloo? And I always tell them, well, if you find a bottle, find two, because I'll be happy to buy one with you. It's a really lovely whiskey. I think even for me, yeah, the bottle of XR behind me is my LaSalle bottle. So I think even for me, I'm out of the Waterloo.
Yeah, I tried the LaSalle, I think about a year ago, and I enjoyed it. I tried that one, and I tried the XO, which is the cognac finished.
Right.
And I thought that was okay. I wasn't too crazy about it personally, but I thought the XR was so good. It was really, really rich, really good.
And that's the idea. I mean, the XR is really the top of the line. You know, it's paying tribute to those distilleries that were part of the family, that were part of the history. It's, when we think about blending, it's giving the blenders that opportunity to say, okay, you have this available to you. What can we do? What can we create from this? And do we have enough to create this consistently for 5 years, 6 years, or however many years? So
how limited is the XR compared to something like the Noble Collection?
The XR, we can stretch the XR a little longer. So I know with the LaSalle, we still have enough whiskey to continue that for at least I don't want to give an exact timing, but we'll be able to enjoy it for a little bit.
Sure.
Longer.
Okay.
And then it will come down to, is there another XR? Perhaps. I don't know. I mean, that's something that's being discussed, but I don't actually know the answer to it yet. I will be just as surprised as everyone else. I hope so. Again, as a whiskey guy, I hope so.
I guess we won't know till we know, I guess.
Exactly. I may know slightly before you, but we'll know.
I would hope so. Talk a little bit about what's next. We have the Northern Harvest Rye that won Jim Murray's Whiskey of the Year, and caused a ginormous uproar with folks on social media.
It did, and it was very exciting for all of us, because we knew we had a great whiskey, as with any of the whiskeys we've tasted tonight and talked about. you know, if it's got Crown Royal on there, we know that it's a great whiskey. We're proud of that whiskey. But for Northern Harvest Rye to be recognized by someone, especially someone like Jim Murray, who I've bought that whiskey Bible every year for, I don't know how many I have on my shelf and how far you're going back now, but I every year read through those, and I love to get his insight and what he's thinking. But to be honored with that was just really, it was incredible. I mean, for lack of a better word, it was absolutely incredible. And I think well-deserved, especially looking at all the folks who work hard to make that whiskey what it is. But that rye was so unique. And I was doing a tasting recently, and a couple of gentlemen came up and said, "Oh, we're not really rye drinkers." And I said, "Well, what do you normally like to enjoy?" And they told me. And I said, "Well, this is a Canadian rye, and this is a Crown Royal rye, and it's a little different. It's a little softer. It's a little more approachable, but it's still going to give you some lovely rye flavor." And they took a little sip, and we chatted for a few minutes, and then they had these big smiles on their face, and they said, "Wow, like if you hadn't have stopped us, we would have never tried it, because we saw rye and we immediately thought, oh, it's going to be kind of harsh and slap us around a little bit, but this is a really lovely, gentle whiskey." And so that was the idea, was to take that 95% rye mash bill that we produce at Gimli, but then blend in some of the other whiskey that we produce, so that we get that nutmeg and that cinnamon and that spice, all the flavors that we talked about, that dryness that we're going to get from the rye, but we're going to balance that out with some of that nice creaminess, with some of those bourbon style notes coming through. And it really creates a very unique whiskey when we do that.
I gave some to a buddy who is not a Crown Royal fan, and I think I may have turned him into a Crown Royal fan with that one. He's like, "Oh, Crown Royal, I don't know. Look, try this. It's a bit different than everything they have on there. It's sort of the odd man out. Try this. Let me know what you think." And he really, really, really enjoyed it.
I love to hear that. And that's, folks often ask me, well, what's your favorite whiskey? And I'll either say whatever whiskey's in my hand, or, I might talk about Reserve, which you and I talked about earlier. But the thing that's very unique about the Crown Royal family is that there really is a whiskey for almost every personality and every mood and occasion, because you can take a whiskey like we've experienced tonight, like Deluxe or Black or Reserve or even Cornerstone. They're all have that underlying Crown Royal quality and that kind of personality to them, but then they're all very unique at the same time. And then when we move into a whiskey like Northern Harvest Rye or Crown XO, which is finished in cognac casks, or even the hand-selected barrel, which is our single barrel of that coffee rye that we talked about, I guess at this point, over an hour ago. It's depending on what your mood is, and depending on what you're thinking, you can sit down with the Crown and say, well, you know what? Tonight I want something a little higher proof. I want something that has this flavor profile. Or you know what? Tonight I really want some Crown Reserve. I really just want to pour something and sit back and, I don't know, 24 Legacies on. I'm going to sit back and watch that.
Yeah, which is what I'm doing as soon as this webcast is over.
So you're an hour behind me, right? So I think mine's, unless my wife has already watched it, mine's I think we're DVDing.
My wife threatened to watch it, but we sort of came to an agreement. Let's wait until she said, how long is this thing gonna last? I said, about an hour.
Yeah.
She said, oh, so 2.5 hours. No. It's about an hour.
Yeah, so, I promised I would cook dinner when we're done, and we'll sit down and we'll watch 24 Legacies. So getting a little plug for Fox there. Anybody watching from Fox, we're plugging your show.
Fantastic.
Send Bobby and I thank you.
Any 24 swag that you guys want to send us, we're happy with.
Happy to take.
So one last question: when you're not drinking Crown Royal or other Canadian whiskeys, I know you said you're a bourbon guy. You're also a Scotch guy, which I would just call a general whiskey guy.
General whiskey guy.
What are some of your favorites? What are some of your go-tos?
Oh wow. I drink a lot of water, just first and foremost. Folks always say, well, what do you enjoy? And I'm like, I drink an obscene
we all do.
Water. The folks that work with me always laugh because I have one water brand that I tend to always just have like 2 bottles with me at all times. And they're like, do they pay you? And I'm like, no, not yet, but they will. It's tough because I'm also a beer guy too. I love beer. I like spirits in general. I think from a whiskey standpoint though, I will have to go with Canadian whiskey Crown Royal. I absolutely love Crown Royal. and we know that. Obviously, we've talked about it all night. When we look at Scotch whiskey, Johnny Black. I've always been a Johnny Black fan, and it goes back to the principles of blending and what we talked about with blending. And to me, it embodies what a great Scotch whiskey should be.
And for the price, it's very approachable. Whenever I do a Scotch tasting here at the house, depending on what it is, if it's just a general Scotch tasting where I'll have a Scotch from every different region, and then I'll have Johnny Walker Black, and I'll usually say, this is sort of Scotland in a glass.
Yeah, it's like to me, it's a little tour of Scotland, because I think you get the East Coast, the West Coast, you get all the personalities, and again, it's that craftsmanship, it's blending, it's the same as what we've tasted tonight. It's blending, it's being able to bring those whiskeys together.
Right.
So I absolutely adore that whiskey, always have. From a single malt standpoint, it really comes down to kind of just mood. What have I not had lately? What am I thinking about? I'm not one of those guys that looks at the weather, or it can be a 95-degree day and I'll drink an imperial stout.
Sure.
I mean, I don't think about things like that. Always been.
Because a lot of people say whiskey is kind of a fall or winter drink. No, whiskey is year round.
I can drink Lagavulin on a 95-degree day in New York City, and
welcome to New Orleans. It's every day.
It's always 95 degrees. So I would definitely rank Lagavulin up there. We talked about that earlier this evening when we got started. Cragganmore is also a lovely whiskey that I think is not underrated, but not one that as many people know, but beautiful Speyside whiskey. When we look at in the U.S., and I see you have a bottle of Dickel 12 over there behind you.
It's almost empty, but yes, I do.
There's nothing wrong with that because it's a delicious whiskey. And, I had the pleasure of spending some time working at the Dickel distillery especially when I was working on Tennessee whiskey. And that whiskey to me, it's like buttered popcorn. I mean, it's just.
Especially right out. A few whiskey folks got invited to Dickel a couple years back. And the master distiller just grabbed this tin can and held it up against, and we got some new make spirit, and it really is sort of like just these buttery kind of kettle corn. It's really, really good, and I don't like new make spirit, and this was something I can see using in cocktails, like vodka or gin cocktails, just to give it a little twist.
Well, that's what was fun, and not to get off on another whiskey at the moment, but there's the Dickel number 1, which is the new make spirit
somewhere in the corner,
which I think and so that's what's great is like when you take that and you look at the lineup that you have back there, it's all about time in the barrel. So you can take that, look at the 8, the 12. They're not ages; they're just different expressions, but they're all. And then I see you have Bullet up there as well, which, Bullet Bourbon to me is just fantastic. I love to see how that brand has grown. I love to see what's happening with that brand. Tom Bullitt, one of the kindest human beings you'll ever meet, and just such a proponent for his family namesake. So there's some great whiskeys there, but I'm just looking behind your shelf right now. I actually just wish I could, I wish I could get there in about 5 minutes because I have.
When you're in New Orleans, if you have a couple of spare hours, I'm 15 minutes away from the CBD. So
yeah, because there are quite a few behind you that really are high up on my list, But the thing with me too is like kind of going back to what we said earlier. Whiskey is meant to be shared. It's meant to be enjoyed. It's about those moments and those good conversations. And quite often, if you and I were out, for example, I might say to you, "Well, what have you not had lately? What are you in the mood for?" You could say, "Well, I'm in the mood for this," and I'll be like, "You know what? Let's have that." Sure. And then maybe if we have 2 rounds, then I'll pick the next round, and we'll definitely have some Crown Royal together as well. But as long as we enjoy it responsibly and we're having fun, that's at the end of the day, it's
what it's all about.
World of whiskey is huge, and there's some great whiskeys out there.
Well, Stephen, I know we're a little bit over my hour.
Yes.
So let's wrap it up. I really appreciate you taking the time to come in and walk me through some Crown Royals that I've never had, and talking a little bit about the history with our viewers. Anything you want to add before we head on out?
No, Bobby, I was just going to say, I appreciate you inviting me to join this evening, and for everyone watching, thank you for taking the time to sit down. And And I hope all of you were having a Crown Royal whiskey or perhaps a cocktail with us while Bobby and I were talking. But, you know, to me, as I said, it's always about good conversation, good people, great whiskey. All of those elements have certainly been in place tonight. And it's been an absolute pleasure to spend the last hour and 10 minutes with you. So you have a TV show to watch. I have dinner to cook. I'm sure I'll have another whiskey to enjoy in that process. But I do look forward
I've got a couple of pours here, so
please do not let those. You know, make sure those are properly enjoyed.
Whiskey doesn't go to waste in this house. No.
I had a feeling. It doesn't. But I do hope that when I'm down in New Orleans, I hope that we can get together for an in-person whiskey. And
that sounds fantastic to me.
And I'd be happy to join you anytime. So anytime you want to do something like we're doing tonight and have good conversation, just let me know.
Beautiful. I may hit you up with some beer suggestions, but I'll tell you about that later.
All right.
Hang on the line. I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.